So, hello and good morning. It is here now at time of uploading. Welcome to my latest stat matchup. This stat matchup matches Roberto Duran against one of my top 10 fighters of all time. Many people say Roberto Duran is a top 10 fighter of all time, so I thought, well, the best thing to do is to match him against one, who also fought around the region where Duran began his career. So, Tony Canzoneri versus Roberto Duran stat matchup. Here we go with the first slide. So, in terms of champions beat individually, okay, Tony Canzoneri wins this one, having beaten 15 champions individually to Roberto Duran's 12. In champions knocked out, okay, Roberto Duran, more explosive puncher, has advantage with 7 champions knocked out to Tony Canzoneri's 4. And in overall fights against champions, Canzoneri wins this one with 36 fights against champions compared to Roberto Duran's 25. Now, wins against champions, again, is won by Tony Canzoneri. He scored 22 wins against champions compared to Roberto Duran's total of 13. KOs against champions, again, goes Roberto Duran's way. He has scored 8 knockouts against champions compared to Tony Canzoneri's 4. Rounds against champions is Tony Canzoneri again, okay, having fought 384 rounds against champions compared to Roberto Duran's total of 255. And wins against champions in title fights. Both of these guys had a lot of title fights. Duran had more title fights for individual belts than Canzoneri did. But Canzoneri edges the wins against champions in title fights with a total of 8 to Roberto Duran's total of 7. Now, the percent of their career fighting champions is slightly edged by Roberto Duran. 21% of his career was against champions, while 20% of Canzoneri's fights were against champions. And champions beat based on what weights they titled in. So this is all the champions that beat on all the individual weight divisions those champions titled in. Roberto Duran edges this one. He beat champions who titled across 9 weight divisions to Tony Canzoneri's 6. So a mixed bag this one. Duran wins a number of them, mainly a number of them the knockout stats, although I would expect that, Duran being a more explosive puncher. Canzoneri could punch as well, but when you're fighting Billy Patrol and Lou Ambers and Mandel and McLarnin, when you're fighting many of the top level fighters Canzoneri fought, many of whom became all-time greats or Hall of Famers themselves, it's not always that easy to knock them out. But Duran edges those. So I'll edge the slide to Canzoneri. Of course, the scores will be at the end by slide. So going on to slide 2. Okay, Tony Canzoneri thrashes Duran in the Hall of Famers beaten. Canzoneri has beaten 9 individual Hall of Fame fighters, more than doubling Duran's total of 4. Now, individual Hall of Famers knocked out. This is a tie. Both Canzoneri and Duran have knocked out 2 Hall of Famers individually. But fights against Hall of Famers, big advantage Tony Canzoneri. He had 23 fights against Hall of Famers compared to Roberto Duran's total of 13. And Canzoneri also thrashes Duran in the wins against Hall of Famers. Duran had 13 fights against Hall of Famers, but only won 4, whereas Tony Canzoneri won more than 50% of his fights with 12. So Canzoneri wins that one. KOs against Hall of Famers overall is a tie. Both scored 2. Now, rounds against Hall of Famers goes Tony Canzoneri's way again. He fought 260 rounds against Hall of Famers compared to Roberto Duran's tally of 142. And Canzoneri also wins in the category of wins against Hall of Famers in title fights. Canzoneri more than trebles Duran's tally of 2 with a total of 7. And the percent of their career fights that were fighting Hall of Famers, Canzoneri wins this one as well. 13% of his career fights were fighting Hall of Fame fighters compared to Roberto Duran's tally of 10. So a more convincing slide to Tony Canzoneri there, with a few draws thrown in, but on most slides Canzoneri wins. So on to our next slide. Okay, rated opponents. Now some people think, oh, Duran's going to win this one, he fought so many fighters, but sadly no. In overall fights against top 10 fighters, Canzoneri more than doubles Roberto Duran's total of 44. What's an impressive total, but no match for Canzoneri's total of 90. Fights against top 3 rated fighters, Canzoneri dominates again, having 50 53 fights against top 3 rated fighters compared to Roberto Duran's total of 33. And fights against ring champions, Canzoneri doubles Duran's total of 9, coming in with a total of 18. So there's the overall fights, but when we go to the wins against fighters in those categories, it is dominated by Canzoneri again. He scored 68 wins against top 10 fighters, more than doubling Roberto Duran's total of 31. Wins against top 3 fighters, again dominated by Tony Canzoneri, with a total of 36 compared to Roberto Duran's total of 20. And Canzoneri also more than doubles Roberto Duran's total of 4 wins against ring champions, coming in with a total of 10 wins overall. So all those first slides totally dominated by Tony Canzoneri. And when we look at rounds against rated fighters, again the domination continues on this slide. Tony Canzoneri fought a massive 842 rounds against top 10 fighters alone. That easily crushes Duran's tally of 428. Rounds against top 3 rated fighters again is won by Tony Canzoneri with a total of 531 compared to Roberto Duran's total of 345. Clash Royale Pro 698, good to see you, buddy. Hope you're well. So rounds against ring champions again is dominated by Canzoneri, 207 rounds against ring champions compared to Roberto Duran's total of 97. And KOs against rated fighters, okay, is won by Roberto Duran. He scored 20 knockouts overall against rated opponents compared to Canzoneri's total of 16. But aside from that last slide, that slide is absolute dominance by Tony Canzoneri in everything except KOs against rated fighters. And again, even when you look at that, Duran wins the KOs against rated fighter stat. But ultimately, you have to consider as well who are a lot of the guys that they were fighting to build the knockout records. Because this is another one of those myths I've long said. You know, you get a fighter like George Foreman and look at his knockout record and the stats. It's fantastic. Okay, it's absolutely fantastic. But if you match it to a Joe Jeanette, for example, and look at the quality of opposition they faced across their fights, you know, that's when the knockout advantage in stats is again enhanced by many of the weaker opponents George Foreman fought a lot of top-level opponents as well, don't get me wrong. But, you know, people rarely consider that. But I do. But in that stat slide there, I mean, aside from last one, Canzoneri dominates. Big shout out to Martin Dunstan. Good to see you, buddy. Hope you're well. So there is the latest slide, dominated by Canzoneri. So let us go on to our next slide, okay? Percent of career they fought, okay? So 36% of Roberto Duran's career fights were against rated opponents. That is bettered by Tony Canzoneri's more than 50%, okay, with a total of 51. Rated fighters beat across divisions. Both Tony Canzoneri and Roberto Duran beat, from the collection of rated fighters they beat, fighters who were rated in 6 weight divisions, both of them, so that is a tie. And wins against rated opponents the year they fought them is also a tie. Both Canzoneri and Duran scored 13 wins against rated opponents in the year those fights happened. Yeah, dose of hype edits. Yeah, good to see you, buddy. So, in overall KOs, now this is where I would expect Roberto Duran to fire back, and he does. Okay, in overall knockouts, Canzoneri scored 44. Roberto Duran scored a total of 70. KOs in 3 rounds or less, okay, Canzoneri scored 23, but again it is won by Roberto Duran with a total of 33. And first round KOs, Canzoneri still scored 14. Roberto Duran betters that though with a total of 21. Now the percent of their career fights that they scored knockouts in their favour, Canzoneri comes in obviously as the lesser regarded puncher with 25%. Roberto Duran knocked out 58% of all his career opponents. In percent of career KOs in 3 rounds or less, Canzoneri scores 13%, but Duran more than doubles that at 27%. And percent of their career that ended in first round wins for themselves, Canzoneri is 8%, Roberto Duran more than doubles it at 17%. So again, I'm not surprised Duran is the more known puncher of the two, again when factored against overall level of opposition and how many fighters did the fight who were very hard to knock out. Ignoring all that, Duran wins the KO stats. So On to our next slide, title fights. Now, again, this is one where people think Duran is going to dominate, and he does win some stats. Although, again, like with the point I made earlier, we also have to remember with the stat matchup that most of Duran's title fights were for single alphabet belts. Okay, David Moore, Barkley, the later Sugar Ray Leonard fights, the Thomas Hearns fight, of course, and all of his lightweight title fights, except the final one, the trilogy fight against De Jesus, because many people still say to this day Roberto Duran was the undisputed champion at lightweight, when actually you look at his career, he was not. He held one belt for all his lightweight title fights and defences, right until the last fight. That is when he won the trilogy fight against De Jesus and finally captured the second belt to become undisputed champion. Most of Tony Canzoneri's fights are undisputed title fights, whereas most of Duran's are single alphabet title fights. But this is a stat matchup, okay, not a... we're not going too crazy. So, in overall title fights, both fighters scored 22. Title fight wins is edged by Roberto Duran. He scored 16 title fight wins to Tony Canzoneri's 12. And Duran also edges the title defences with another interesting statoid some people don't realise. Roberto Duran won titles in 4 weights. He only ever defended titles in 1. That was lightweight. His other 3 titles where he won weights, welterweight he lost the rematch to Leonard, light middleweight he never defended, and the middleweight title he never successfully defended. So he only made successful title defences in 1 weight at lightweight. Another interesting little factoid there, because some people still come to me and say Duran were undisputed king for nearly 7 years. No, he wasn't. There were other champions there running concurrently beside him. He was the better of the lightweight champions, but he was not undisputed his whole reign, only for that last fight, and then the belts were gone. So I've long said that if Duran would have stayed at lightweight another 2 years, made 4 or 5 defences at undisputed title, it had strengthened his title record massively. So overall title fight KOs, he's won by Roberto Duran, of course, 13 compared to Tony Canzoneri's 2. Now overall title fight rounds is edged by Tony Canzoneri. He fought 259 title fight rounds to Roberto Duran's total of 222, and the percent of their career fights that were title fights is won by Roberto Duran at 18% compared to Tony Canzoneri's percentage of 12%. If I did percentage of career undisputed title fights, Canzoneri would thrash him. Percent of career title defences is won by Roberto Duran, 10% compared to Tony Canzoneri's 4%. Now, rated opponents in title fights, okay? In terms of wins against top 10 fighters in title fights, Roberto Duran wins this one with 14 wins compared to Tony Canzoneri's 10. He also wins in wins against top 3 rated fighters in title fights with a score of 10 compared to Canzoneri's total of 6. But Canzoneri scored more wins against ring champions in title fights, scoring 5 to Roberto Duran's 2. Dose of hype edits. Didn't know Duran never defended the other 3 weight classes he won titles in. Only lightweight defences. Interesting. Yeah, Duran's made 12 defences, all of them at lightweight. He never defended any other titles. And in the other 3 weight divisions, he never got undisputed or unified. He was only ever a single alphabet holder. I've long said that a fighter like Canzoneri, who did have some non-undisputed title fights, but virtually most of his title fights are full undisputed lineal title fights, and I think sometimes between the alphabet era and the non-alphabet era, people don't factor that. I once did a matchup between an old undisputed champion, I can't remember who it was, and Oscar De La Hoya, and I showed all the title stats, and De La Hoya thrashed him. But then I went to undisputed title stats, and the old champion thrashed De La Hoya. It's just something that many people don't factor. So I always say, like with Terence Crawford, he hasn't defended all his titles he's won, but he has won undisputed in multiple divisions, and that's to be recognised. So he's won undisputed titles in more divisions than Roberto Duran and many other fighters, interestingly enough, without going into resume aspect. So, title fight, slide 1, okay, is edged by Roberto Duran, clearly. Now, when we go on to world titles 1, okay, this is won by Tony Canzoneri. In overall world titles, okay, Canzoneri won 5. undisputed. Okay, Duran won 5 world titles overall. In terms of lineal titles, Tony Canzoneri held lineal titles on 5 occasions to Roberto Duran's 2, and Canzoneri held 5 undisputed titles across his career to Roberto Duran's 1. In terms of world titles across different weight divisions, Canzoneri was a 3-weight undisputed champion. Roberto Duran was a 4-weight champion, so Duran edges that. In terms of titles, lineal titles they held by weight, Tony Canzoneri held lineal titles in 3 weight divisions. Roberto Duran is 2, and Tony Canzoneri was a 3-weight undisputed champion compared to Roberto Duran's 1, which was of course again lightweight. So overall, over that slide, fairly dominated, aside from a few by Tony Canzoneri. Of course, with them masses of lineal and undisputed titles, 10 overall compared to Duran's 3. Yeah, that's eye-opening at best. So, when we go on to our next slide, okay, it is how they were rated themselves as fighters. So, Tony Canzoneri was top 10 rated for 11 years. He didn't have a massive career like Roberto Duran. He fought many years less. So, still did well with 11, but Duran wins that with being rated 15 years. Now, being top 3 rated, okay, after Duran is rated as a top 10 fighter for longer, Canzoneri was a longer top 3 rated fighter at 6 years compared to Roberto Duran's 3 years. And Duran was a ring champion for 7 years, which betters Tony Canzoneri's tally of 4. So both of these fighters were top 10 rated across 4 divisions, so that is a tie. They were also both top 3 rated in 3 individual divisions, so that is a tie, and both fighters were ring champion in 1 division. And in overall ring rating points, Duran edges this with a total of 204. The ring rating points, basically, I have a simple system that awards points based on position each year you're rated, and then all those totals are added up, and that creates the ring rating points. So Duran edges that 204, 276. So over the last 2 or 3 slides, we're now on slide 6. Duran has done well, but let's not forget for the matchup later that Canzoneri was thrashing Duran earlier, especially in the rated opponents and many other things. So we will get the score at the end. So going on to our next slide, okay, is pound for pound rankings and records. So Tony Canzoneri was top 10 pound for pound ranked in my all-time rankings for 7 years. Roberto Duran comes in with a total of 6. Now Canzoneri was pound for pound top 3 ranked in my all-time rankings for 5 years. Roberto Duran was never top 3 ranked pound for pound. Canzoneri was also a former pound for pound number 1 rated fighter for 1 year in my all-time rankings. Roberto Duran again is 0. Now overall fights against pound for pound rated fighters, Canzoneri had 31 fights, so that is more fights against pound for pounders than Usyk has had career fights by a number. That thrashes Roberto Duran's total of 20. Fights against pound for pound top 3 fighters is closer, but still won by Tony Canzoneri with a total of 13 to Roberto Duran's 10. And fights against pound for pound number 1 rated fighters, Roberto Duran wins that one with 5 to Canzoneri's 0. So they are the overall numbers of fights against pound for pounders. Now when we jump into the wins in those categories, Tony Canzoneri scored 17 wins against pound for pound fighters, which beats Duran's total of 10. Wins against pound for pound top 3 fighters is again won by Tony Canzoneri with a total of 7 to Roberto Duran's 5. And Tony Canzoneri never had a win against a pound for pound number 1 fighter. Roberto Duran edges it with 1. KOs against pound for pound fighters, like many of the KO stats, is won by Roberto Duran with a total of 6 knockouts against pound for pound fighters compared to Tony Canzoneri's total of 3. So there's the first slide on pound for pounders. Let's go on to the second slide. Finish the pound for pound stats off. Rounds against pound for pounders is a thrashing for Roberto Duran. Tony Canzoneri fought 336 rounds against pound for pounders. That is a huge number of equivalent 12-round distance fights against pound for pounders alone. That betters Roberto Duran's total of 215. Now individual pound for pounders be, and I think it was Dose of Hype Edits who asked a legitimate question actually, because on my videos and slides I do put champions knocked out and KOs against champions, and thank you for I believe it was you highlighting that, because I didn't realise they sound very similar. I should have been more distinct. But yeah, champions knocked out is individual names. Like individual names is, I think I answered it in comment, but I'll refresh anyway. Floyd Mayweather beat 22 champions, but wins against champions is 24. So champions knocked out, if they were all knockouts, champions knocked out for Floyd would be 22. KOs against champions would be 24. That's how it is. But in a way, thanks to that comment, I was looking at it thinking, well, actually, it does sound a bit, similar. So individual pound for pound fighters beat. Okay, Tony Canzoneri beat 14. That betters Roberto Duran's total of 9. Now pound for pound fighters knocked out. Not surprisingly, Roberto Duran edges this one with 5-2. Tony Canzoneri's 3. And pound for pound wins in title fights. Okay, Tony Canzoneri edges this one with 7 wins against pound for pounders in title fights to Roberto Duran's 6. And yeah, dose of hype edits. I don't know when you came on live stream, but if you scroll back, okay, to the rated opponents slide, because everybody says, oh, Duran's got such a stacked resume and he fought all these rated guys. If you go back to the rated opponents slide, you'll really see Tony Canzoneri destroy Duran. Duran's total of 44 compared to Canzoneri's total of 90. He's crazy. Thanks for clarifying. I like the way you rate the stats. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. And yeah, Tony Canzoneri was putting in work. His resume is so stacked with so many Hall of Famers and champions, pound for pounders, and top 5 rated fighters. It's really crazy, his career, considering he had a big career. Well over 150 fights as well. The level of opposition is just ridiculous when you break it down. At some point in future, I will do a year-by-year breakdown on fighters like Canzoneri and Rosenblum, etc. And some years and opposition they fought is staggering. So anyway, pound for pound wins in title fights edged by Tony Canzoneri. Now wins against pound for pounders the year they fought. Okay, so this is wins against pound for pounders when they were rated in that same year that the fighter were rated. So Canzoneri scored 4 wins against fighters who were top 10 pound for pound rated that year. It's harder to do that now because back then they were fighting a lot more each year. So if they lost to Tony Canzoneri, they could beat 5 other top names that year and still score in the pound for pound ratings. It's a bit harder now with fighters fighting once a year or once every 18 months or twice a year if we're lucky. It's much harder for fighters now to do that. So many modern fighters will not score well in that category. So Roberto Duran scores 1, so won by Tony Canzoneri. So now, okay, earlier we covered the slide, okay, on rated opponents. Now that is historic overall rated opponents. Now let's go through the slide that features their record against rated opponents the year they fought them. And here we are. Now, if you look at the numbers, some of the numbers on Canzoneri's side are quite crazy. So wins, but I'm focusing on wins mainly. It's wins I'm looking at. So wins against ring champions the year they fought them. Canzoneri scored 4, Roberto Duran scored 1. First place wins, Tony Canzoneri has 4 to Roberto Duran's 2. Second place wins, Canzoneri has 5 to Roberto Duran's 1. Third place wins, Canzoneri has 5 again compared to Roberto Duran's 1. Fourth place wins, Canzoneri has 2 to Roberto Duran's 1. And fifth place wins, finally, Duran scores a win, scoring 3 wins to Tony Canzoneri's 2. But if we just pause there, I want to highlight another point. How many fights is that against ring champions and top 5 rated fighters they fought? So for Duran, it's 4, 5, 6, 10, 14. So Duran had 18 fights against rated fighters who were rated top 10 or ring champion the year he fought them. That's 18. Canzoneri has 3, 5, 10, 12, 14, 19, 20, 27, 38. So 38 fights Canzoneri had were against rated opponents the year he fought them, dwarfing Duran's total of 18, but that isn't factored on the scoring. Just another interesting point. When you look at the top 5 rated fighters and ring champions they fought, Canzoneri dominates Duran. So in 6th place wins, Canzoneri scored 4 to Roberto Duran's 1. 7th place wins, Canzoneri scored 3 to Roberto Duran's 1. 8th place wins, Canzoneri scored 3 to Roberto Duran 0. 9th place wins, Tony Canzoneri scores 1 to Duran 0, but Duran did score more wins against 10th rated opponents with 2 wins to Canzoneri's 1. So aside from the last slide, that slide is absolutely dominated by Tony Canzoneri, who not only had 38 fights against top 5 fighters and ring champions the year, who were rated the year he beat them, to Duran's 18. He had 11 fights against ring champions to Duran's 4. And top 3 rated fighters, I mean, it is a thrashing. Canzoneri had 7 against 3rd place to Duran's 1. He had 7 against 2nd place to Duran's 4. And he had 8 against 1st place to Duran's 4. Insane numbers by Tony Canzoneri, easily beating Roberto Duran on that slide. So let's go now to the last slide and see the score. I already know where this has gone, but let's go through it anyway, the score total. So slide 1, Tony Canzoneri scored 5 points to Duran's 4. Slide 2, Canzoneri scored 6 points to Duran's 0. Slide 3, Canzoneri scored 9 points to Roberto Duran's 1. Slide 4, the KO stats, of course. Duran scored 6 to Canzoneri's 1, and Duran scored 7 points on slide 5 to Canzoneri's 2. Canzoneri scored 4 points to Duran's 1 on slide 6, and slide 7, Roberto Duran scored 3 points to Canzoneri's 1. Slide 8, Canzoneri won 7 points to 3. Slide 9, Canzoneri won 4 points to 1, and slide 10, Canzoneri won 9 points to 2. So ultimately, okay, when we go down the score total, we can see from the 85 possible points, 76 of them were won. Okay, so 9 stats were drawn with no winner. But Tony Canzoneri has easily won the stat matchup, scoring nearly 50 points from 85, even factoring the draws, with 48 points to Roberto Duran's total of 28. And if you actually think about, many of those points Duran won there were actually KO stats across the different categories. When you look at the Champion Hall of Fame stats, rated opponent stats, many of the pound-for-pound stats, utterly dominated by Tony Canzoneri. The title fight stats is more of a mixed bag. Duran wins a number of them again. When you're a boxing fan looking at it, you also have to factor with a unified, undisputed title fights, lineal fights. Canzoneri wins in that regard. But in purpose of stat matchup, Duran did quite well in those categories, looking at the overall stats. But yeah, a stat matchup that has one fighter, Roberto Duran, that many people tell me is a top 10 all-time fighter, matched against one of my actual top 10 all-time ranked fighters, Tony Canzoneri. And to me, Canzoneri fairly dominates much of the stat matchup. So that is my latest stat matchup. I have more stat matchups incoming. I've got Jeff Smith and Mike Gibbons. I've got Maxi Rosenblum and the great Ezard Charles. I've got Sam Langford and Harry Greb, as well as many more career videos coming on many fighters going forward. I'm also going to work today on my next heavyweight fantasy card that will go on my community page. And then fantasy cards after that, I'll start covering cruiser, light, heavy, super middle and middle, as I start building the history of those divisions as well. I'm going to take a break now before adding any more divisions. I've added 5 divisions, 5 divisions, so a good start. But yeah, Tony Canzoneri convincingly wins this stat matchup. And even though Duran scores some very impressive stats in multiple categories, some of Tony Canzoneri's stats are just otherworldly. 90 fights against rated opponents, more than double Duran's total. More than 50 fights against top 3 rated opponents. Silly, crazy numbers. Anyway, there's my latest stat matchup. Big shout out to everyone in the chat. Hope you were all well. I'll be back later on tonight with a career video, and I'll be back over coming week with many more videos to come. I'm the Boxing Librarian, and I'm out for now.